I'm actually glad you brought up NEAT though, because that kind of ties in with another topic I wanted to mention, which is maybe 1 or 2 years ago now, there was talk of the constrained energy model.
Mhm.
And I believe that was looking at is it the Hadza? And they were saying how
Yeah.
even though they were super active, they weren't actually, eating that much more. I have an intelligent acquaintance who it seems like anytime he sees NEAT brought up, he's like, why are we even talking about this? It doesn't even matter. It's, look at the constrained energy model. And there was that response in regard to, I don't know if you saw James Krieger using the weighted vest recently with one of his clients, and that's kind of gotten a little bit more popular. And to me, I thought that was kind of misunderstanding what that model was, but obviously I want to hear your opinion. So my understanding of that model is basically that populations who have a long period of time of doing extreme amounts of activity will eventually adapt so that they're not actually burning that much. Not that if somebody does a 12-week study, the conscious effort to have more steps or wear a weighted vest or any of that is irrelevant. Would that be accurate?
I would say yeah, and so I have a couple of ways that I think I like to frame this data that can seem contradictory. Um, I think you did a really good job. First, let me just say I agree with that framing. The the work by I believe Ponzer on the Hasda is really interesting in that it shows that there probably is a constrained total daily energy expenditure to some degree. That these counterbalancing effects are there, which makes a lot of sense from a survival perspective. If we actually burned more calories hunting and gathering than we got in, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about it today, right?
Right.
Um, so that sort of must be true, and I would say that data shows that. But I think we're making a comparison between the Western world in what is essentially after a couple thousand years of agriculture to one of the very few remaining, mostly non-agricultural hunter-gatherer societies on the planet. And I think that comparison may not be a fair one. Um, there's some really interesting work on energy flux, which is a concept that there may be some regulatory mechanisms in people related to total energy output. It's not just the body fat set point. It's not just hunger hormones. It's not lean mass necessarily. I think it's all of it. But there may be something of our body expects to have a certain energy output. And it has different ways to get that. So if you take a person with obesity who is not very active, they're going to have a very high energy output. But if they diet and start doing cardio, they can have the same energy output at a lower body mass level. And if you look at some of the data on what is one of the most potent tools we have to maintain lost weight, it's keeping a high activity level. And there's also data showing that individuals with a quote unquote moderate or high activity level of daily life are have a more finely tuned hunger and satiety response to meals, and therefore they're more likely to eat an appropriate intake for their energy expenditure. This is the so-called J curve energy intake you see when you go from sedentary to low to moderate to high activity. So I think when you look at that all together, we see that being sedentary is probably a bad idea, you know, and that probably causes some issues, and being an obesogenic environment compounds with that. So that's one kind of piece of information, and I think you can look at it and go, well, cardio is not useful except maybe to maintain, weight loss once you get there. But I think that's probably an overly negative view, because if you look at the actual data, like we don't have to compare the Hasna to us to get an idea of how much we compensate with NEAT from doing cardio. Like, don't do cardio because you just do less NEAT. There's actually studies on that, fortunately.
Hmm.
And there was, God, I can't remember the year or the authors. Just gonna have to trust me that this isn't just stuff I'm making up. But there was a study that looked at the individual response to doing cardio and creating a deficit. There's actually been a couple of these studies. The one that is on the tip of my head right now was where they looked at basically how much energy compensation happens, and that 70% of people still produced a deficit, while only 30% were able to compensate. Now, this doesn't mean that the 70% produced the deficit they expected, but
Right.
this means that 7 out of 10 people cardio does something that is in the direction of their goals. Even if, I did 500 calories of cardio, but you actually burned 200, like that will make your math get messed up. That will be frustrating. But I think it is to use the HASDA data and ignore that and say, cardio is useless. I think you're going to get a non-negligible, 30% of people, if we use that data as representative of the one true mean, to say, yeah, there's a fair amount of people who cardio, at least at a certain point, or maybe past that point, they require more than you'd expect. It won't be as effective as I'd like it to be. But I think there's another study that showed, I think they did 500 or 1,000 calories of cardio. And I think almost everyone in the 1,000 calorie of cardio group couldn't fully compensate. So there is a limit. It's not like I run a marathon a day, but I just completely go into a catatonic state like a hypothetic bear for the other, whatever, how many, 18 hours of the day. And I burn the same amount of calories. Like, that's not possible. It doesn't happen. There is only so much your body can compensate, and it doesn't happen in everybody. But it does happen in enough people that it can be problematic. And I think they're probably disproportionately shown in our clients. That's another thing, and this is a separate topic, and then I'll shut up and let Trexler talk for a little bit. But I think when we report our anecdotes as coaches, there's two things. There's two different biases that come into that. One, there is the selection bias of people who get results really easily don't hire coaches. Mm-hmm. But I think even more important is that when I sit here and I think of those light bulb moments where I'm frustrated and I have a memory of it and I talk about it on a podcast, it's the times I couldn't get it to work. And I'm forgetting the 600 times I added cardio and things went great.
Right.
But it's that one person who I'm absolutely positive they were actually doing cardio, adherence was high, we had a great relationship, and I was throwing cardio at them, and all they were doing was getting a great VO2 max, but not losing weight.
Right.
So I think there's a lot that goes into that. So I think being aware that cardio is not always as consistent of a tool and may not add up is good, but having this very myopic view that it does nothing and maybe at best it helps with maintenance, I think is probably not supported by the data, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons that I and many people find a caloric deficit or like through diet is more effective a lot of the time. You take away those 300 calories and it's an actual 300 calories, not, well, the treadmill said I burned 300, but in reality it was 250 and I would have burned 50 sitting around anyway, and all of that. And I got more efficient at it over the last 12 weeks, so I think it's a little more straightforward with diet. But yeah, especially over a 12, 16, shorter term diet, I don't think cardio would be useless at all for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, like with my clients and with my own diet, I've been pretty vocal about the fact that I'm not super dependent on cardio, just because I think it has nothing to do with the hypotheses regarding constrained energy expenditure or anything like that. People seem to be happier if you don't make them spend an hour a day on the treadmill, which is pretty cool. The additional training volume that you have to deal with, the recovery burden you have to deal with. So in practice, I've never gotten into a situation where, I added this cardio and I just can't find the deficit that was supposed to be created. So I've never found a need as a practitioner to dig into this hypothesis of constrained energy expenditure in this type of application, because usually it works. I usually get a person who now is losing more weight, is in a bigger deficit because we increase cardio, but they're way less happy and they don't recover as well. And so those are the issues that I typically have to deal with when it comes to cardio. It's not like, I thought we introduced this deficit, but it's nowhere to be found.
Right.
I don't often find myself in that position.
Gotcha.
Can I add two minor things? Okay. So in defense of cardio, because I'm thinking of my anecdotal experiences where sometimes I have leveraged cardio a lot. One is when the absolute number of calories for an individual have to get really, really low. And I'm just not comfortable, regardless. Like a lot of times we think, it's still 12 kcals per pound, or whatever. But there are some things that don't scale linearly with calories in terms of micronutrient and mineral intake, where I'm just like, this is 1,000 calories. Yeah, on paper it's the same as me being on 2,000, but there are things you just can't do with 1,000 calories that you can with 2,000 in terms of diet variety that aren't proportionate, and I'm actually worried about micronutrient deficiencies here, et cetera. So in very lightweight individuals, male or female, sometimes I will prefer to leverage cardio a little more.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was the only thing I wanted to add. I did say two things, didn't I?
You did.
Yeah, see that's the thing. Whenever you're on a live podcast, you never give a number, because if you
I
say you
have
have
some
three things to
things.
add, if you say you have three things to add, you're going to get exactly two of them. Or if you say two, you're going to get one. I totally agree. There are instances where I'm thinking of one client in particular where I was just like, I know what the math is telling me I should do for your calories, but there's no way I'm going to put that into a spreadsheet. I'm not comfortable with it. And so in those cases, yeah, you do either leverage cardio, or if you already feel like you've kind of maxed out where you want the cardio to go, then you have to say, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
Which is not the conversation you want to have, but sometimes it is one that you have to have.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I saw
And
the
I
light bulb go off
fortunately,
there.
yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, thanks Trexler for stepping in there and giving me the space to be like, what the fuck was I gonna say? The other thing I will say, and this is totally anecdotal, is that since we have been having people track their steps, I think I don't want to give the impression we use steps in place of cardio, because we don't often do that. But what we really like to do, because some people do seem to have their steps drop subconsciously, is that we establish steps for our clients in the off season or early on in prep, and we just ask them to maintain it. Ever since we've started doing that about a couple of years ago, the head coaches, because I have a lot of clients I've worked with for a very long time, but they have a turnover, so they've all got 20 to 40 at any given time. We mentioned this a couple of times in meetings. In the last couple of years, Brad, Jeff, and Berto, none of them have brought up like, I can't figure out what's going on. I'm throwing cardio at this person. They're not losing weight. That anecdote has become way less frequent and way less occurrent. So I think what that maintenance of number of steps is doing is eliminating some or a substantial enough amount to remove this anecdote of that variability in that constrained quote unquote model and people who tend to adapt a lot more. So that's not in defense of cardio per se, but I will say that if you can clamp one element of the things that your body might be down regulating, then it should be removing some of that variability and making things make more sense mathematically from a fat loss perspective.
Just
That additional detail makes a lot of sense, because like I said, in practice, I never really find myself in a position where, like I said, I added the cardio and I'm like, where'd all the calories go? But I do track step counts. So usually, if I see, oh, I added your cardio and your steps went down by, several hundred per day, well, there's that mystery solved,
Mm.
So that does make a great deal of sense.